Hello, everyone. This is JD Calderon, and this is Indie Comics Explained. Today, I'm talking to the incredible Stephen A. Roman.
Hey, thanks for having me on, JD.
Hey, anytime, Steve. Now, listen. So this is all about you, and so I want you to explain to everybody who you are, what you've been doing, and what Stephen Roman is all about.
All right, so Steve Roman got his start wanting to write comics back when he was a teenager, just like pretty much everybody else at some point or other. In 1988, I took a class with Frank Thorne, who is the artist on Red Sonja, called How to Draw Women the Frank Thorne Way. And so in 1989, boop, I came out with a small press comic called Lorelei about a succubus who travels around New York taking the souls of evildoers. And it was a badly drawn Frank Thorne-ish kind of comic, but it was good enough for me to want to get into small press publishing at that point. So I started doing that. And then in 1993, oh, here comes the next one.
Oh, cool.
I came up with the Lorelei full-size comic. So that came out in 93 and it ran for about 2 years. And it was a little too heady. I'd read too much Cerebus back then. So I thought, oh, I could have a multi-issue series, but halfway through, the comics industry kind of fell apart with all the distributors falling under Diamond Distribution's heel. So that ended that. Although then in 2001, I brought Lorelei back with a new series, but that lasted even less because nobody was really interested in it. So I moved on and became a professional book editor for 10 and a half years, working for a company called Byron Price Visual Publications and its offshoot iBooks Inc., where I called myself the editor-in-chief and no one argued with it. So while I was doing that, I was offered the opportunity. I was
Sorry about that.
I was offered the opportunity to write what became my first novel, which was a Spider-Man young adult book where he fights the Hulk. But the joke on that one was the covers had already been printed for an author who had already been hired to write the book and it was rejected. So I wound up being his ghostwriter because they were too cheap to reprint the covers. So that was my start. But it got me then the ability a couple of years later from the same publisher to come out with X-Men: The Chaos Engine trilogy, which were 3 original X-Men novels that I wrote between 2000 and 2002 that established me now as a novelist so that I could actually try and pursue that idea. But I still hadn't given up on comics. So at one point, the same publisher, Byron Price, came to me and offered me Stan Lee's Alexa, which was a chance to write with Stan Lee. And the funny story about that is he saw my script for it, called me up and said, so every third word is like bold-faced. Where did you ever get that idea from to do that? And I went, from you? So it went over okay with Stan. But so then after that, I left Byron Price. I got into self-publishing again. And in 2010, I revamped the company that I had done my Lorelei comics under, Star Warp Concepts, now as more of a book, horror, sometime comic company. And I introduced it in 2010 with a comic called The Saga of Pandora's Zweiback, about a teenage goth girl who lives in New York and has spent 10 years seeing monsters. And so she's been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. But it turns out when she meets an immortal shape-shifting monster hunter named Annie, that she actually has a power that allows her to see through the disguises that monsters wear. So this comic is actually available as a free download, as an e-comic from the Star Warp Concepts website. So that is still available. And that led the next year to...
Hold on. Slow down.
Oh!
Slow down. Now that that comic book,
Yes.
is it available as physical? Some of us like to hold things.
No.
No.
There were 3,000 copies of that I
Mm,
handed out at New York Comic Con in 2010 and various conventions the following year. So there are only maybe 5 or 6 still in my possession.
okay.
So the only way really now these days to get it is to download it from the Star Wars Concepts website.
Gotcha.
And what you get is Pan introducing herself to the reader, and you get a sample chapter from the first novel. Here it comes.
There we go.
Blood Feud.
Nice.
The Saga of Pandora's Wyback, Book 1. And that's the thing behind me. The banner behind me is a painting by Bob Larkin, who is a former Marvel Comics painter. He used to do the covers of Dazzler and Spider-Man, the X-Men. And so I was lucky enough to hook up with him when he had done the covers for my 3 X-Men novels. So Bob did that. And so that launched the company in 2011. And since then, I've just been publishing other books, other things with Pan. Lorelei made her return in 2012 as a graphic novel called Sex and the City, because we're all about the bad puns.
Right.
And it was my tribute to the Vampirella comics that I grew up in the 70s reading along with the Marvel horror comics. So I got a bunch of Vampirella era artists. The cover is by Esteban Maroto, who used to do covers for them, as Bob used to do covers for Warren. And there's a 1-page history of succubi by the late Ernie Colon, and a frontispiece by the late Tom Sutton, who was Vampirella's first artist way back in 1969. So I did that, and that leads us now to today, speaking of Vampirella, and the book that I have called From the Stars of Vampirus, an unauthorized guide to Vampirella's classic horror adventures, now on sale, available from the Star Wars Concepts website, as you can see, and from places like Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Amazon UK. So, and that brings us up to date.
All right, cool. So let's dig in a little bit. Now, how did you so you worked as editor-in-chief at Byron Price Visuals.
Yes.
Now, how did you fall into that? Like, how did you get that job? What was the process of you becoming the EIC of Byron Price Visuals?
Well, I first got hired by Byron Price Visual. I'd answered an ad in the New York Times for an assistant editor for their children's book division. And I had no background in children's books. But I'd been self-publishing comics for a couple of years by then. So I thought, what the hell? So I sent in my resume, and they were not impressed with that aspect of it. But it turned out that Byron was packaging comic books for DC at the time and for Topps. So for DC, he was doing the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy comic adaptation, and 9 Princes in Amber, the first of Roger Zelazny's Amber fantasy novel series.
Right.
So I came in and they looked at my resume and said, well, he has no background in children's books, but he's got this comic book thing. So, okay, we could fit him in there. But what they didn't know was it was all small press, and I was making stuff up as I went along, but good enough to get hired. So I worked at that for a few years. And then in 1999, Byron decided that he wanted to become a book publisher. So he had been co-publishing at that point with Berkeley Books, doing books based on the Marvel Comics licenses. So he had started a very successful line of original Marvel novels with the X-Men and Spider-Man, Daredevil, and all of that. So having had a taste of publishing that way, he wanted to go full bore. And the way I became editor-in-chief was I was literally sitting there in his office one day and he went, "So you want the job?" And I went, "Okay." And that was how I became editor-in-chief. And actually, he didn't call me editor-in-chief. I did. And his response was, "It doesn't cost me anything else. So sure."
Mhm.
And that's how I got it.
Okay, cool. Now, so obviously you worked with various different writers, artists, so on and so forth. Now, what was your approach to? Now, were you picking books, or was Byron just bringing you things and you were just editing?
A lot of it was Byron would pick things or buy the rights to something and then come to me and go, "Okay, so here." And it would sometimes be up to me to find an author for the books. Sometimes through his connections, he'd already have an author in place. And when it came to licensed publishing, my job was not just to make sure the author did his job, but to look out on behalf of the license owner. So we did 4 books of the Transformers.
Okay.
It was 3 original novels and an anthology.
Mhm.
And my job was to make sure that Hasbro was happy with how these books were coming out.
Mhm.
So on the first novel, I got into it with the author when I was reading the manuscript and asked him when he thought, who was it? Bumblebee was gay.
Uh,
And he said, "Oh, you picked up on that." And I said, "What did I pick up on?" And he said, "Oh, well, I thought that the relationship between Bumblebee and I forget who the other Transformer was. There seemed to be more of a dominant submissive relationship to them. So therefore, in his head canon, they were a couple." And I said, "That's not going to go with Hasbro. Probably not. Because if it hasn't been actually established, you can't just make things up."
Mm.
And yes, I was right about that. They were not.
You were not happy with
Well,
that.
it was a case of if the material were there,
Right.
if it had been established by Hasbro or writers who had worked on Hasbro properties,
Mhm.
then they wouldn't have had a problem with it.
Right.
But for an author who really wasn't a fan to just come in and go, "Well, that's my interpretation and we should go with it," that's not how licensed publishing works.
Mm.
And so it happened a lot with authors that I would work on with licensed publishing, is that they would, I liken it to Hollywood writers in that they get into a headspace where they think that they're going to improve the property that they've been hired to work on.
Mm.
And you can do certain things with that. You can try and add depth to it and maybe come up with a new angle for a character, but you can't just do an overhaul of the established character just because it's based on what you think would be best.
Right.
The licensor always has the last word. So I had a Witchblade novel once where the author not only hated the comic, tried to write it like the TV show, which I told him we didn't have the license for, but didn't even bother to research New York, where the book was set. So his geography was all over the place. He hadn't even bothered to look at a map.
Mm.
So I beat the crap out of his manuscript and then sent it back to him all marked up in red and said, "I hope you like the changes because this is what's going to the printer already."
Mm.
So I'd already made that decision. And Top Cow was happy with the book. And that was the bottom line. The author did, though, come back to me later on and apologize and say that he appreciated the fact that I had beaten him up for the betterment of himself and the book. So that was sort of my reputation as an editor working for Byron Price, is that if you were handing me stuff, you were getting a beating.
Now, okay, so let me ask you a question. What was the most difficult thing that you would have to convey, not just to one author specifically, but just like overall? Like you saw like maybe a general mistake that most authors were making, right? And, if, as an editor, what was like the most difficult thing to convey to them? Say, listen, guys, don't do this or do this, or so on and so forth.
Well, it depended on the author and it depended on the project, because you could have someone who was really talented and who knew what they were doing, but then they would take some bizarre turn with where they thought the characters were going, and you'd have to rein them in. And the pros would always go, oh, okay, all right, fine, I get it. The difficult ones would be the authors where you would tell them time and again, you can't do this, and they would do it anyway. And I edited a Spider-Man novel once where the author had Spider-Man killing people. And I said, what is it about Spider-Man that makes you think he would kill people? And he went, well, the circumstances. And I went, no, Spider-Man doesn't kill people.
Right.
So he got more than a beating on his manuscript. I actually rewrote so much I could have been listed as the co-author, and his agent actually played with that notion. And I went, no, just we're fine. Let him keep the money as long as we get to keep his name on the book.
Right.
So that's how we worked it out. But there are some authors that just won't listen. And it's not so much the story as the headset that you have to deal with certain authors.
Gotcha. Now, moving into self-publishing.
Yes.
Now, obviously, you took this course, right? And you did your own thing.
Yes.
What else, aside from Frank Thorne, influenced you as an independent creator?
Well, Stanley, number one, just because I grew up reading his comics. And so Stan was a major influence into how stories were built. But Stan had sort of co-created the Marvel method of writing, which was he came up with a plot and he handed it off to an artist and went, do whatever. And then they would come back with 22 pages of art and he'd go, great, now I'll just add the dialogue and the captions and build it up from there, which has never struck me as being the best way to craft a story. You may differ. I
agree with. I actually agree with you.
But
I'm a script person myself.
It depends on the artist. But as a writer, I'm more comfortable having more control over the story's pacing. So when I write, it's full script, and I actually learned the format for full scripting from some article that Paul Levitz had written in some DC magazine like 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And so that's where I found out how to format a comic script that I still use to today. It allows me to have a firmer grasp on the story. I tend to pace by dialogue, because the one thing I did pick up from Stan in his lessons over the decades was when you have a right-hand page in a comic, always try and write it like a mini cliffhanger to make the person turn the page to see what happens next. So I always take that approach. Where I loosen up is when I see the art from the artist, because sometimes, like an artist that I work with named, and I'll massacre his name now, Elizu Guvaya. He goes under the name Zoo, Z-E-U, is a phenomenal artist. And he's come up with aspects within the stories that I've handed him visually that I wouldn't have thought of. And when I see that, I'm willing to adjust my writing to play off of it. So there'll be I'll cut some dialogue, or I'll move some dialogue, or in a couple of instances, I'll just look at the panel and go, that doesn't need any words, and just
Right.
leave it blank, just leave it silent, because then it's more dramatic. And so if you have that kind of relationship, you can sort of loosen up the work ethic. But yeah, so, Stan is where I got it started from. Alan Moore, when he came along on Swamp Thing, that was another major influence. That was probably the second step after Stan. Dave Sim with Cerebus. Bill Mantlo. David Michelini. J.M. DeMatteis. All became people whose work influenced the style that I've developed over the years now.
All right, cool. Now, but what drove, okay, so obviously you were creating your own thing. What drove you to self-publish as opposed to trying to seek out a publisher?
I had come across a magazine about the same time as taking the Frank Thorne one-day class. It was a one-day class at a Comic-Con. It was called Small Press Comics Explosion. And it was a magazine devoted to the small press of people who created their own comics on photocopiers and sold them through the mail and mailed them to each other. And it was run by a guy named Tim Corrigan. And through Small Press Comics Explosion, I learned that there was an entire world of people who just made their own comics. And I thought, oh, let me try that. So that's where that Small Press Lorelei comic came from. It was me just sitting down and wanting to do my own comic and putting that out in 1989. And then showing up at my first comic convention with a little table to try and sell my little comic. And, it's what got me juiced up for doing that kind of stuff. And I tried, when I went full size with Lorelei, I did try and see if there might be a publisher who would want to pick it up, because at that point, 92, 93, the Ninja Turtles had already created the explosion of small press publishers and black and white comics. But I couldn't find anyone. So I just went, screw it, I'll do it myself. And so it became a self-teaching moment of how to stumble through and do my own self-publishing and put the comics together. And it was every bad step along the way because I didn't know what I was doing. And, but when the first issue came out, I was thrilled because here I with the help of an artist named David C. Matthews, not the singer, and a cover by Louis Small Jr., who had just started on Vampirella for Harris Comics, I was able to put out Lorelei #0. And I looked at that and went, holy crap, okay, I can actually do this self-publishing thing. So that's what kept me going after that point.
Okay, cool. Now, as time went on, obviously, you're doing more work. Now, what are you working on now? I know you just finished a project. What are you working on currently?
For Star Wars Concepts?
Yes.
For my own company, the long-awaited third book. Oh, it's a trap. It's the long-awaited third book in the Pandora Zweiback series. I showed you the first book, Blood Feud. The second book had come out called Blood Rain. The third book that's in the works is called Blood and Iron, which closes out the trilogy of novels, but not the end of Pan's adventures, because I have others in mind, and even a crossover with Lorelei and other things like that. So right now, that's the focus. After I'm done pushing this Vampirella book.
We're going to get into that in a minute.
All right.
That's coming. That's coming.
But yeah, and so and Star Wars Concepts isn't just me. There's an author named Richard C. White. I publish his books through my company. His are mostly sort of mainstream fantasy. And actually, the best-selling title that I have right now is Rich's book for gamers and writers called Terra Incognito: A Guide to Building the Worlds of Your. Oh, is it? Yes, A Guide to Building them.
It's only a best-selling book. It's okay.
You know what? Hang on. I'm going to be rude.
There you go. Go get it.
Let me just get the book.
There you go.
There it is. A Guide to Building the Worlds of Your Imagination. Because you know why? I'm so used to just calling it Terra Incognito.
There you go.
that subtitles leave me. But that is the best-selling book. It's actually being used as part of a gaming design course at a college in Massachusetts.
Oh, cool.
So that's doing very well for Rich. I've kind of nudged him a couple of times about doing the sequel that he's planned for it, since obviously there's an audience for it. I also do publish what's called illustrated classics, are classic horror novels that have 6-spot illustrations in them. So I've done J. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla with illustrations by Zoo, who also provided illustrations for Edgar Rice Burroughs' A Princess of Mars.
Nice.
There is what else is there? Oh, there's King Kong. Did King Kong as an ebook because King Kong had its 85th anniversary a couple of years ago. So that is that's out there, and occasional little comic books. So Lorelei has popped up in a couple of comic books, and Pan had a one-shot full-color comic book that Zoo illustrated, and so it's not just 3 or 4 books. There probably at this point I'm well over, I don't know, a dozen or so, heading toward 20.
Okay, that's cool. All right, now, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, Vampirella.
All right.
So now, how did you get into Vampirella? Like, what drove you to that? Because,
hormones.
Yeah, but we've been friends a long time, and like my course through comics seems to be similar but divergent, very different. You understand? So I'm very curious as to like what got you in and what got you that into it that you really hooked on.
It was literally a cover with a half-naked chick on it that I found out was a comic book.
Gotcha.
In what was it? 1977. Vampirella 55. I found it in a mom and pop newsstand store, like the old days when you pull the comics off the racks. And there was this half-naked girl in a bathing suit and go-go boots. And so that got me to pick it up. And when I read it, it turned out that it was a best of issue, a collection of the first Vampirella stories by Archie Goodwin, who became a big name in comics. He was editor-in-chief at Marvel. He wrote Star Wars and Iron Man and tons of other comics. And so he was a legend. So back in the early 70s, he wrote Vampirella for Warren Publishing and sort of set the style of what the series became, introducing her love interest and his father. They're Van Helsing, so they're descendants of Van Helsing from Dracula. He introduced her sidekick, who's this alcoholic magician named Pendragon, and he introduced a group called the Cult of Chaos that was based on his readings of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos and the Cult of Cthulhu. So he set all that in motion. It's what's carried Vampirella 50 years to today, with those same concepts still in place, not in use as much as they used to be, but they're all still there to be used. So it was the half-naked girl that got my attention. It was Archie Goodwin's writing that got me to actually stay with the comic. And then I started reading the issues going forward as they were taken over in different directions. And then I started collecting the old Vampirellas where I could find them, and eventually managed to build up the entire collection over a number of years so that I have the entire run. So now, that's where it started from.
How many issues does that comprise?
112, with the rare 113th issue that Harris Comics published in 83, I think it was 83, 84, when they got their hands on, no, in 1988, they got their hands on the license and tried to republish it as a magazine, but it was all reprint material, and it had a very low print run that only went to mom and pop newsstands. So if you didn't get it, it got pulped. So it's kind of rare.
Okay, cool. Now, what do you cover in the book? Like what exactly do you cover in that book?
The book covers the Vampirella Warren years. So her time from 1969 when she launched to 1983 when Warren Publishing went under and declared bankruptcy because the company fell apart. The sales weren't there. The owner, James Warren, had stopped coming into the office, and it just kind of all fell apart. So it starts with Vampirella's creation. There's a chapter on how she was created by James Warren and Forrest J. Ackerman, designed initially by Frank Frazetta, overhauled by Trina Robbins to the costume that everyone recognizes today. And from there, I go into a full breakdown of every Vampirella story from the entire 112 issue run, with little notes that I put in for interesting little trivia that I may have come across as the stories go along. Then from there, for a lot of Vampirella fans, the draw of the book is I go into the history of a 1975 film production that was supposed to be made by Hammer Films, starring a B-movie actress and Playboy model named Barbara Lee, who had been chosen to play Vampirella, alongside Hammer legend Peter Cushing, who was going to play Pendragon, the magician. And there was a script written, and everything seemed to be going well. They made an appearance at the 1975 Famous Monsters of Filmland horror convention in New York, where Barbara Lee showed up in the Vampirella costume. And even before the convention was over with, the movie was completely falling apart. And so I tell the story as best as I've been able to put it together, because there have been a lot of conflicting reports about how that happened and where it went and who was involved in the casting. And so I try and put it into a chronological order that makes sense now. And from there, I do another section that's behind the scenes of the 1996 Vampirella movie that was made, starring Talissa Soto and Roger Daltrey, which is probably one of the greatest low points of Roger Daltrey's career. It's just god awful. It was done by Roger Corman. It was produced by Roger Corman, and
Right.
even the director Jim Wynorski hates the film and doesn't like to be reminded of it.
Right.
So I tell that story. Then there's a checklist of all of Vampirella's appearances during the Warren years, as well as where her stories were reprinted by Harris Comics and now Dynamite Entertainment. And a chapter that examines the 6 Vampirella novels that were published in 1975 and 76 that were written by Ron Goulart, that were novelizations of the Vampirella stories, where he had to get really creative to take these short 20-page comic stories and turn them into 60,000 word novels. And actually, they're pretty good. When I reread them, I was actually surprised. He sort of writes them like pulp fiction. So Vampirella is a lot tougher and more sure of herself than she is in the comic books. So I do all of that, and then there's a sort of where are they now epilogue that tells you what happened with Warren Publishing at the end, and what happened to the rights with Vampirella, and what happened to the people who were part of Warren Publishing back then.
Gotcha.
So it was a lot of work.
So now, how long did it take you to do all this?
If you piece it all together, probably took me 6 or 8 months.
Okay.
Because I had to read all the comics, and I had to read the novels. I had to sit through that god awful Vampirella movie from '96, and I read the screenplay, which is a rare thing from the 1975 film that never got made, courtesy of Sean Fernald, who is the official Vampirella historian. It was a title that he got while he was working for Forrest Ackerman years ago, and while he was working for Harris Comics. So it was me reaching out to whoever I could find. So I reached out to a mutual acquaintance named Richard Boom, who runs a site called Comics for Sinners that I used to do Bad Girl TNA comic reviews for, and Doctor Who comics, and asked him if he knew anyone, and he knew Sean. So he put me in touch with Sean, and Sean not only provided me with a copy of the screenplay, but he provided the majority of the photographs that are in the book that came directly from Forrest J. Ackerman's archives. So I will admit, and I admit right up front in the book, there's not a lot of art in the book, because since it's an unauthorized book, I would not like to make Dynamite Entertainment angry with me for using it. So there is a frontispiece of Vampirella by Bob Larkin, but then the other illustrations in the book are mainly photographs that Sean provided, including a copy of James Warren's original memo to Forey Ackerman describing this character that he wanted, a female horror host that could run her own magazine. He had thought of it as, he kept calling it a mod witch. And that lasted apparently until both of them saw Barbarella. And then it was Forey Ackerman who came up with the name Vampirella. And it went from there. So Sean provided all that material. Ben Dubé, who is the nephew of the late Bill Dubé, who was probably the longest running writer on Vampirella, as well as editor and editor-in-chief of Warren Publishing. He provided me with background as to what happened to Warren Publishing after it went under. And so he provided me with material that I bring up and had access to. So if you want to find out what was going on with Warren and the Harris Comics pickup of the rights, and so you can find that out in the book as well. They were the two that those guys were a major help for me for getting it done.
Cool. Now, the manuscript you read about the movie. Now, in reading it, could you have visualized this becoming a really good movie? Would have been
No,
B?
no, it was terrible.
Okay.
It was terrible. It
Okay.
was um, hmm, the the idea is that in the comics, a United States spaceship that somehow we were able to send into space, although we hadn't gotten past the Apollo mission at that point,
Right.
crashes on Vampirella's planet of Draculon. And
Mm,
she feeds on the crew and then flies the ship back to Earth, and that's where her adventures begin. So that was in the comics.
mm,
The movie would have been this scientists, evil scientists, working on a dimensional portal that carries Vampirella by accident from Draculon through the Bermuda Triangle to Bermuda. And the reason she winds up on Bermuda was Hammer Films wanted to shoot there because they were going to have a half-naked actress walking around in a swimsuit.
mm,
It would be easier for her to be in a warm climate. And I guess it would be like a vacation for everyone. So they worked it with the tourist board to set it up that they'd be able to do that. And what they didn't know was eventually the tourist board started getting complaints from the residents of Bermuda who went, oh, there's this comic about this girl and she's half naked and she fights the devil and we don't want that around here. So they were going to run into that.
right.
So the rest of the screenplay are just sort of awkward attempts at adapting elements of Vampirella stories while turning it into, I don't know, as the story progresses, it turns into like a bad James Bond film where there are sets blowing up and aliens on spaceships, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The Van Helsing characters are treated like jokes.
Right.
The only thing that would have carried well probably is the relationship between Vampirella and Pendragon, which seemed to carry into the screenplay, but it would have really depended on the chemistry between Barbara Lee and Peter Cushing to carry it off, so it didn't seem as awkwardly written as it appears in the screenplay.
Gotcha.
But yeah, if it had been made, no one would be looking back fondly at it.
Gotcha. Now, without going into too much detail,
Yeah,
because we want people to pick up the book.
exactly.
What would you consider the highlights of, I guess, the run on Vampirella? Like, what are the books? Like what are the runs that you would say, like, these are the ones I'll go back to. These are the things.
Well, the Archie Goodwin run is always good because it did the world building. He set all the elements in place that every writer after him followed. Bill Dubay was mostly good, but he could be hit and miss. I actually told Ben up front that I enjoyed Bill's work, not all of it though, but Bill Dubay came up with he actually tried to explore the Pendragon character so that he wasn't just a sort of running gag as the drunk who falls back on the bottle whenever things get bad. He actually tried to provide some depth to him that brought a lot to the character. And usually it would be Dubay who did that. Most of the other writers just fell back on the, oh, he's a drunk aspect of the character. So there are sections of it. There's a two-part Pendragon story that explores his background, tells you who he is, and that he basically abandoned his family after his wife had an affair. So he abandoned his wife and his daughter and became a drunk when she started having an affair with her boss, and he couldn't take it anymore. The poor man. So, he set it in motion. So so Dubé did that. He also did a story arc where Vampirella went back to Draculon to see what had become of the planet, and added depth to her because there were aspects of her story while she was there before Goodwin took over that had never been explored before. So he did a lot of that. So I would say the Goodwin stuff, Dubé stuff for the most part, and the rest is sort of hit or miss. The rest, when the stories aren't that good, you rely on the art, and that's where guys like Jose Gonzalez, who became a legend because of Vampirella, and Gonzalo Mayo, they became the Vampirella artists. Right. And so if the story wasn't all that good, you always had the good art to fall back on.
Okay, cool. Now let everybody know where can they get this. I'll have it in the show notes, but let everybody know where can they get this book.
Well, hang on.
Oh, yeah, more?
No. I just want to clear something because I'm not sure I was talking so fast.
Oh, okay.
I did say Bill Dubé, right? Not Bill Mantlo.
Yes, you did say Bill Dubé.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure.
Okay.
I just want to make sure. I don't want to stumble over it because his work was important.
Okay.
So you were saying where people can pick this up?
Yes, where can people pick up this book?
Well, obviously they can get it from the Star Wars Concepts website, as you so helpfully show. But what we also provide are links to where you can buy it from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Amazon UK. For some reason, the book sells better in the UK right now than it does in the States. So where are all the American Vampirella fans? Let's get on the stick here, huh? And start picking up this book. The ebook, it's only available as a PDF in 2 places. And that's because of the design elements that were involved, the fonts that were used, and the photographs. So it's not a general Kindle kind of thing. So it's available as a PDF ebook from Star Wars Concepts and from Drive Through Fiction. And we also have the link to that at From the Stars of Vampiris page. So you can buy from us or you can buy it from other retailers. We're getting you money either way. So, and we'll thank you for your business.
Cool. All right, now. All right, we're almost at an hour here, so we'll close out. So, is there anything that maybe I didn't ask you that you want to talk about?
Let's see. I am writing a comic for another publisher right now. Oh, cool. Thanks for reminding me, although you didn't. Let's see if I can pull it up. It's a publisher called Honorique Comics. The publisher is based in France, but the comics are in English and available through Indy Planet in print and digital. I will so you'll never be able to see it. It's an iPad. So I'll just say it. It's called Citterell, the Last Earthman, and it's written and drawn. It's created and drawn by an artist named Chris Malgrain, and I am the stan on the comic. It's his sort of tribute to 1960s, 1970s Marvel type comics. So Citterell is a very Silver Surfer vibe. He's very down on himself. It can be kind of depressing. He's the last Earthman because everyone else on Earth has been wiped out, and he takes to the stars to find intelligent life and hope that he's not alone in the universe. And so I come in and I script it. I do the dialogue and I do the captions, but the plot and the art are all done by Chris. And it's been getting good reviews. People, we're hitting the marks where we're supposed to with that sort of Stan and Jack collaboration. I'm happy with where it's going, and I'm working on the script for issue 2 right now. Citterell, you can get at Indy Planet. Actually, the download is free, so you can get this comic for free. Chris would appreciate it that when we get out of quarantine, you order the print copy so that he can make something a little back for paying me to write his comic. So I have that going on. And I think that covers it.
Okay, hold on. Let me pull something up for you.
I'm not doing anything for you.
No, no,
Yeah.
no.
What are you pulling up?
Oh, actually, let me do this. Okay.
Here, look, I wrote a cartoon once. X-Men Dark Tide, which you can buy on DVD years ago.
Oh, cool.
I was brought in at the last minute and did a script doctoring, so I got a DVD for it.
Oh, that's cool.
What are you looking for? There it is. Okay.
There it is.
There is Citadel. So yes, available at Indie Planet. Free download. You can buy it now, and whenever Indie Planet gets out of quarantine, they will print and ship the comic to you. So that's on sale right now. And I also edit for Chris on his other superhero comic called The Formidables, which you can find at Indie Planet by going to the Honorary Comics page there. It has all his titles.
Yes.
So
now I have 2 questions in closing. So
yes.
Now the first, we're going to exclude Bob Larkin because you already had him.
We love Bob Larkin.
Yes, we love Bob Larkin, but we're going to exclude him for this one. So if you had a choice of any artist, living or dead, doesn't matter, who could illustrate, paint, however you want to do it, a cover for you for one of your books, who would it be?
Jose Gonzalez.
Oh, okay. All right.
Jose Gonzalez or Enric, but I know I can't afford Enric. He's still alive, but I can't afford him.
Gotcha.
I was actually surprised I was able to get Esteban Maroto to do a cover for me for the Lorelei graphic novel. But that one was funny because for the money he charged, I was only supposed to get her just standing there with a blank background. But he liked the design of the character so much, he went crazy and drew all these demons in Dayglow paint. So, okay, worked for me.
Exactly.
So, yeah, Gonzalez would have been awesome.
Right.
Enric, if I had $5,000.
I know you. I know your pain, sir. I know your pain.
Yeah.
Now, if you were given the keys to the kingdom, right, and you got the call up to Marvel and DC, what are the books? And you could do anything you want. They said you got free reign. What would be the 2 books you would do?
To write?
Yes.
Give me Satana the Devil's Daughter.
Wow. Okay.
Well, she's a succubus, and actually she was part of the inspiration along with Vampirella for the creation of Lorelei.
Interesting. Because
Lorelei came about because I didn't want to do a vampire. Everybody does vampires. Satana was a succubus, and I went, "Oh, that's different." So that's where I got that from. So Satana the Devil's Daughter, and years ago I wanted to do Cloak and Dagger, but it would have been leaning more toward the style that Bill Mantlo had done when he co-created them.
Right.
So it would have been sort of that sort of 80s vibe to it that nobody wants at Marvel these days.
Right.
But yeah, so those would probably be the 2. Because I mean, I've written a Spider-Man novel, I've written an X-Men trilogy, so I've done those characters. So they're covered.
What would you do over at DC?
Oh man, I used to think Amethyst, Princess of Gemworld, just because I was a big Ernie Colón fan, and that's my all-time favorite Ernie Colón comic.
Right.
I did start to do a pitch for Night Force back in 2003 or 4, which was the Marv Wolfman, Gene Colan comic when they went over to DC.
Mhm.
But I kind of backed out of it because the idea that I was coming up with for a couple of the characters I thought was too good, and that if I handed the pitch in, DC would then own it. So I pulled out of it. So yeah, Night Force maybe. I would probably, yeah, I lean toward the obscure ones that, that I grew up reading. Oh, Star Hunters. There you go. Star Hunters. I was crazy for that comic because it was all Star Wars back then. And there's just something goofy that I love about that comic. So yeah, I do Star Hunters. I do Star Hunters with Zoo.
There you go. All right, cool. All right. So, Steve, you have anything else you want to tell everyone before we go?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for having me on, and thank who's ever watching this thing. I put the word out there, and hopefully the Vampirella fans are checking this out, and they'll go out and buy the book. Again, it's called From the Stars of Vampirus, an unauthorized guide to Vampirella's classic horror adventures, on sale now. And so go out, buy the book, enjoy it, and hopefully in the future, JD, we'll have more to talk about.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Everybody, click, hit subscribe, share out the video, let everybody know that these interviews are going on. I'm going to be bringing more independent creators on here, artists, writers, so on and so forth. So thank you so much, Steve. You're awesome. Your book is awesome.
Thanks, man.
I'll be talking to you soon, man.
All right.
All right. JD out.